The silent dawn, the dust hung in the air like a golden curtain as Jake Martinez adjusted his worn leather hat against the evening sun. His ranch stretched out before him, acres of dry earth dotted with cattle that moved slowly in the fading light. The silence was complete, broken only by the distant lowing of his herd and the creak of the windmill that had been spinning the same lazy circles for 20 years. Jake had grown accustomed to the quiet. At 43, he had lived alone on the ranch for the better part of 2 decades, ever since his father passed and left him the land. The work was hard but honest, and the solitude had become his companion. He spoke to his cattle more than he spoke to people, and some weeks the only human voice he heard was his own. That evening, as Jake was checking the water troughs near the main corral, he heard the rumble of an approaching truck. Visitors were rare on his remote property, and he squinted through the dust cloud to make out the familiar shape of Tom Bradley's old pickup. Tom owned the neighboring spread, though neighbor was a generous term when the properties were separated by 15 miles of scrubland. The truck pulled to a stop near the barn, and Tom climbed out, followed by a heavy-set man Jake didn't recognize. The stranger swayed slightly as he walked, and Jake caught the sharp scent of whiskey on the evening breeze. Between them walked a girl, perhaps 16 or 17, with long dark hair that caught the last rays of sunlight. Her clothes were simple but clean, and she kept her eyes fixed on the ground as the men approached. "Jake," Tom called out, removing his hat in greeting. "This here's Frank Morrison. Says he's got a proposition for you." Frank Morrison stepped forward, his words slurred but his intentions clear. He was a man worn down by drink and desperation, his face flushed and his hands shaking slightly. "My daughter here," he said, gesturing toward the girl without looking at her. "She's deaf, you see. Can't hear nothing. I can't take care of her no more." Jake's eyes moved to the girl, who stood perfectly still, her gaze never lifting from the dusty ground. Something in her posture spoke of years of careful invisibility, of learning to take up as little space as possible in a world that had no patience for her. "I heard you might be looking for help around the place," Frank continued, his voice growing more urgent. "She's a good worker, real quiet, won't give you no trouble at all." Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he realized what was happening. This wasn't about employment. Frank Morrison was selling his daughter, using her disability as justification for abandoning her to a stranger. The girl, he realized he didn't even know her name, remained motionless, as if she had learned that stillness was her best defense against the world. "What's her name?" Jake asked quietly. "Sarah," Frank replied, seeming surprised by the question. "She don't talk much, on account of not being able to hear herself." Jake studied Sarah's face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes despite her downcast gaze. There was something about her stillness that didn't quite fit with what he was being told. She held herself with the alertness of someone who was very much aware of her surroundings. Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting his role in bringing Frank Morrison to the ranch. "Jake, you don't have to." "How much?" Jake interrupted, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. Frank named a sum that revealed both his desperation and his complete disregard for his daughter's worth. Jake walked to his truck without a word, returning with the money in cash. He counted it out slowly, his movements deliberate, while Sarah finally raised her eyes to watch the transaction that would determine her fate. As Frank Morrison pocketed the bills and stumbled back toward Tom's truck, Jake caught something in Sarah's expression, a flicker of awareness that seemed inconsistent with her supposed deafness. She had followed the conversation with her eyes, not with the confusion of someone trying to read lips, but with the clear understanding of someone who had heard every word. After the truck disappeared into the growing darkness, Jake and Sarah stood alone in the settling dust. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now, not the comfortable solitude Jake had known, but the careful quiet of two people taking each other's measure. "You can hear me, can't you?" Jake said softly. Sarah's shoulders tensed, and for a moment he thought she might continue the deception. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Why?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "It was easier," she said, her voice rusty from disuse but clear. "When he drank, he forgot I could hear. Said things he might not have said otherwise. And when people think you can't hear, they don't expect you to answer back." Jake nodded, understanding, more than she might have expected. "You ever work on a ranch before?" "Some," she admitted. "I know how to handle horses, and I can cook, if you need that." "I need a lot of things," Jake said, looking around at his property with new eyes. "But mostly I need someone who won't run off at the first sign of hard work." "I won't run," Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that convinced him she meant it. Over the following weeks, Jake discovered that Sarah's supposed disability had been her salvation in many ways. Years of careful observation had made her incredibly attuned to the world around her. She could predict weather changes by watching the behavior of the cattle, could spot a lame horse from across the pasture, and could work alongside Jake with minimal conversation, understanding his needs through gesture and context. More importantly, her presence filled the ranch with something Jake hadn't realized he'd been missing, not just companionship but purpose, teaching her the finer points of ranching, sharing meals in comfortable conversation, and planning improvements to the property gave structure and meaning to days that had previously blended together in solitary routine. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, Sarah spoke into the peaceful quiet. "He never even asked my name," she said. "Frank, not once today." Jake considered this, understanding the pain behind the observation. "Well," he said finally, "I'd like to know more than just your name, if you're willing to share." Sarah turned to look at him, and in her smile Jake saw not gratitude, but something far more valuable, the recognition of someone who had found, quite unexpectedly, a place where she belonged. The ranch was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of shared work, quiet conversation, and the gentle rhythm of two people building a life together, one honest day at a time.